solve quadratic equations by factoring. Now, the key here is that you have to be able to factor. So that is really an important prerequisite to actually using the factoring method. So first, let's just talk about a quadratic equation. Now, a quadratic equation has a 2 as the largest degree, meaning we're going to have an x squared or a y squared. Some variable is going to be squared, and that's how you know it's quadratic. In factored form, generally, we're going to have two terms multiplied by each other. Now, we generally think of this as being a binomial times a binomial. It could just be the variable x times a binomial. It doesn't matter. Two things multiplied together tells us we're going to be in factored form. The key here is that they equal 0. That's important because if we think about this, if I'm multiplying two things together and one of them is 0, then the whole thing is 0. So once we have this in factored form, two terms multiplied together to be 0, then we know that one of them is going to be 0 because when something is multiplied by 0, the result is 0. Okay, fine, let's do this. Here we have an equation already in factored form. We've got the binomial x minus 4 times the binomial x plus 2, and both of those together multiplied equals 0. So the first thing we're going to do is set each of those binomials equal to 0 and solve for x. Because we know when two things are multiplied by each other, as long as one of them is 0, the whole thing is 0. So either x plus 4 is 0 or x plus 2 is 0. Well, math there isn't too bad, so we know that x can be 4 or x can be negative 2. Either one of those values will make our entire equation 0, and thus we have solved that quadratic equation. Now let's do one where we do not start in factored form. So here we have x squared plus 5x minus 24 equals 0. In order to solve by factoring, our first job is to get our polynomial equal to 0. And here you can see that happens. We have a trinomial equals 0. We are ready to factor. So thinking through your factoring piece, our c value of negative 24 means the two constants inside our binomial are probably going to be a positive and a negative. So I factor this to be x plus 8 and x minus 3. If you need some help on factoring, we have other videos for you. But here, we're assuming that you can factor a trinomial into two binomials. Now that we are in factored form, the binomial x plus 8 times the binomial x minus 3 equals 0, we are ready to set each binomial equal to 0. So we break it up. X plus 8 equals 0 and x minus 3 equals 0. Next, we can do the math. For the first one, we subtract 8 from both sides to get x equals negative 8. And the second one, we add 3 to both sides and we get x equals 3. So again, we have two possible solutions, negative 8 and 3. Let's get a little more difficult. X squared minus 11x plus 16 equals negative 12. Now, hopefully, when you see this, you're thinking, that does not look like the last problem that I solved. And that's because to solve a quadratic equation by factoring, the equation must equal 0. I find it easiest to solve when my quadratic term, the x squared, is positive. So here, we are going to add 12 to both sides. That will allow my left side to become x squared minus 11x plus 28, and now it will equal 0. Remember, when you're manipulating equations, you're going to add the like terms. So because we're adding 12, which is a constant, it gets added to 16. Now I have a trinomial equaling 0, so we can factor. That factors to x minus 4, x minus 7 equals 0. Therefore, I can set each binomial equal to 0. So x minus 4 is 0 and x minus 7 is 0. That gives me x equals 4 and x equals 7. You can always substitute these values back into your original equation, and you'll notice that the left side and the right side are equal. Let's do perhaps one more. Now we have the quadratic equation 2x squared minus 4x equals 0. And you're thinking, yeah, this equals 0. Life is easier. So, we need to factor in order to solve for x. Well, we don't have a trinomial. We just have a binomial. And hopefully you also notice each term in my binomial is even, and they each include an x variable. So I can factor out my greatest common factor of 2x. When I factor out a 2x, I am left with x minus 2. So now I have a monomial 2x multiplied by the binomial x minus 2, but it works the same. I'm multiplying two things together. So I will set each term equal to 0 to solve for x. So my first term is 2x equals 0. The second term is the binomial x minus 2 equals 0. And therefore my two values are x equals 0 and x equals 2.